Solzhenitsyn says in his Red Wheel that the only real liberal in Russia was Pyotr Stolypin. He wanted a constitutional order that was friendly to religion, that promoted social and political progress without nihilistic revolutionary. The cadets, the ruling party, the constitutional Democrats, who were certainly part of the provisional government and part of the February Revolution and the liberal opposition before 1917 in the Duma, they never condemned terrorism. Milyokov, who became foreign minister in the provisional government, said, if we condemn terrorism, it would be the end of the party. What kind of liberals refuse to condemn indiscriminate terrorism? Namely, Russian liberals and the kind of liberalism that Dostoevsky describes and highlights and condemns in Demons. So I don't think Dostoevsky's account of Russian liberalism is particularly a caricature. Um, and let me talk some more about. And by the way, I'm glad you brought up the conversion of Stepan. We don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but a reader of literature might ask how believable is it that Stepan, this soft, indulgent, liberal, by the way, not only did he not get a real education, but he claims he was expelled to the provinces because he posed a terrible intellectual threat to the Tsarist regime. I don't think anyone in Moscow or Petersburg had heard of Stepan Trofim,
Verkovensky.
Verkovensky, but that's part of the charm too. And of course, he's taken under the wings by Stavrogin's mother, who is a former owner of serfs who also loves entertaining, flirting with progressive ideas without taking them very seriously. But in any case, there's a scene in chapter 4 of Demons. It's called All in Expectation, at least in the translation that I'm using, which is the Piver and Volkomsky. The two discuss Nikolai Chernyshevsky's earlier extremist revolutionary tract, What is to be Done? And you'll remember that the title and also the destructive revolutionary nihilism advocated by Chernyshevsky would be freely adopted by Lenin himself. So Stepan tells us that he had studied What is to be Done to find out where this strange destructiveness, embodied by his very son, had come from. So it's very interesting. Stepan sort of accepts the ideas that are in the air, but he's disturbed by their consequences. And this is the most revealing comment that he makes to his son. He says, "I agree that the author's basic idea is correct, but so much more horrible for that." Well, if you begin that the basic idea of the Russian radicals are correct, that the world has to be transformed in a radical and systematic way, that the old verities, God, country, the very basis of the monarchy, everything in Russia has to be overturned. It's very hard to say, I accept the ideas, but I refuse the means that are necessary to that task. And Pyotr points that out to his father. You can't affirm the basic truth of the ideas in that turgid and nihilistic catechism and then say to your son, well, what are you doing? And, so Stepan says the ideas have become perverted, distorted, and mutilated. But I think in this case, Dostoevsky, well, it's true, Stepan is not a bad man. He's a weak man. He's under the thumb of Vera. He's incoherent spiritually and politically, but he's decent. And after the fire, after the conflagration, after the murders, And at the time of his conversion, boy, it's really striking. He speaks a lot of French during his conversion. He's out of it, and half the dialogue is in French. I was very struck on rereading the book recently. But anyway, he says, and this is a direct response in a way to Shigayov. He says, he talks about Shakespeare and Raphael and how the wisdom and beauty of their works far transcends any political or revolutionary cause. In other words, at the time of his conversion, after this deadly revolution and murderous revolutionary conflagration, the terrible fire after the ball for the governesses that Mrs. von Lemke had sponsored, Stepan repudiates the basic idea of the revolutionary catechism. So he's really made a conversion, a genuine conversion. He repudiates his milquetoast middle way, you might say, but
he repudiates the culture of repudiation.
He does.
In the words of
that affirmation of Shakespeare and Raphael could be made by any of us, or Roger Scruton, or anyone who rejects the subordination of literary, philosophical, theological truth to a social cause or political movement. So that is, that proclamation of his fidelity to beauty is, he says, even the freeing of the serfs. Was anything more important for Russian progressives than the freeing of the serfs? And yet the truth and beauty inherent in the works of Shakespeare and Raphael are more important. And yes, there's a figure in this book. You brought up Gertzen. There's a figure in this book who's based on him, and he's represented very likably. I think Dostoevsky had the number on these guys. He saw that the liberals wanted to hold on, you might say, parasitically or residually to some of the old virtues, a certain gentlemanliness and decor, learning for its own sake, and yet they had no really persuasive retort to the revolutionaries. And I mentioned before the cadets' inability and unwillingness to condemn revolutionary terrorism. We're talking about 10,000 people who are. This is after Dostoevsky's time, but just between 1905 and 1908, when Stolypin put down the terrorist movement, something like 10,000 people were murdered indiscriminately. Right? A liberal party or liberal and progressive intellectuals who refuse to condemn those kinds of actions have given up the game, So it's interesting. Stepan, in his sort of in his fevered statements that accompany his conversion, he commits himself, and I like this quote, to fighting the big and little demons that have accumulated in our great and dear sick man Russia. Boy, it couldn't be said any better. These, yeah, Stepan, and again, I raise the question of its literary believability, because the Stepan we've known for 600 pages, it's hard to imagine that he could have such absolute clarity about the disease, the pathologies, the confronting Russia. But he says these are insane and raging, right? That's exactly Dostoevsky's point. And it's this context, remember, in the conversion scene, that Stepan asked to have the account of the Gadarene swine read to him. And that's Luke 8:32-36. That's also one of the two epigrams to the book. So that's where I think Constance Garnett, her title, possessed, and in some French editions is possédé. I think it comes from this idea that the whole class of people, including maybe these indulgent liberals, have been possessed by a kind of Satanism, by the spirit of modern destructive ideology. And of course, we all know that the Gadarene swine, Jesus gets rid of the demons by sending them into the pigs that go off the cliff, right? And that's a kind of metaphor for the destruction. Quote, this is one little provincial town. But remember, Piotr thinks, Verkovensky thinks that there are hundreds of such cells all over Russia. And you could say, no, this was a singular revolutionary cell in the context of Dostoevsky's novel. But there were, in effect, cells of demons all over Russia, some active and terroristic from the people's will to later social revolutionaries, but others just intellectual cells. And then, of course, the sort of liberals who, as I said, who are motivated by this philosophy, pandemia gauche. Just a few years after the publication of Demons, the police chief in Petersburg, Trepov, was murdered by the people's will. And in a very famous case of jury nullification, the Russians always talked about society, as opposed to the regime or the court or the monarchy. The members of civil society, middle class, upper class people from Petersburg found him not guilty. I mean, how found is Verzasalich, a revolutionary, actually had a very interesting correspondence with Karl Marx, who was sometimes for terrorism. He was a bit more of a voluntarist than his official philosophy of history might suggest. But anyway, everyone saw Verzasalich do it. She was guilty of sin, and yet she was found not guilty by a group of progressive members of society. That's the same mentality that inspired the early Stepan, that inspired Gertsen, that inspired the Cadet Party in the years leading up to 1917.
Perhaps, Dan, perhaps we should also tell our colleagues and friends that this book, The Demons, was supposed to be read by Lenin. Somebody offered him in 1872 to offer the novel. He thought this is a piece of reactionary literature not worth reading. Maybe a conversion of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov would have spared us from the horrors of the Bolshevik Revolution. But since you've mentioned the chapter where Pyotr talks about the culture of repudiation, in the words of Roger.
You want me to read some of those quotes?
Please do. Please
do. Okay. So I would say at the heart of the Demons, and certainly the reason why the book has been of immense practical interest, is the revolutionary program of the nihilists themselves. And that was what I was talking about before. As a diagnostician, as a phenomenologist of moral nihilism and terroristic revolution, Dostoevsky is unsurpassed. So Pyotr champions, as I mentioned before, the revolutionary program of the cell's theorist, Zhigalyov,